Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with the heartwarming tale of how becoming a man once involved bleeding in public, while elderly men silently judged your posture. From getting your teeth knocked out as a symbol of maturity, to being whipped in rhythm by elders who called it education, to watching your childhood disappear somewhere between a bush camp and your last baby tooth. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy unsettling history, sarcastic commentary, and the occasional spiritual trauma. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Midnight in Lagos, dawn in Lisbon, or hiding under a blanket somewhere in Ohio. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe light a candle or a mosquito coil, and let's step barefoot into the dust, where manhood wasn't a milestone, it was a test. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one microwaving sadness at 2 a.m. to the sound of rain and algorithm-approved heartbreak playlists. Not the one scrolling through inspirational quotes and wondering if puberty ever ends. No, imagine instead, you're born under a roof made of grass, in a place where the stars are nosy, the goats have opinions, and the fire in the courtyard has seen more drama than your therapist ever will. In this world, there's no finding yourself. You're found by men with sticks and expectations. There's no awkward teenage phase. No, he's just going through a lot. You're a boy until the village decides you're not. And that decision, it involves blades, dust, and the kind of silence that makes even the birds uncomfortable. If you'd been born among the Dinka, the Xhosa, the Nuapik, a region, pick a century, they all agree you wouldn't get pimples and panic attacks. You'd get fire rituals and your lower incisors removed with a rock. Your coming of age wouldn't be marked by a birthday cake. It would be marked by a scar no one's allowed to talk about unless they earned one too. You wouldn't get to sulk. There are no phases in this economy. Your body isn't a mood board. It's a statement, a blood-stained announcement. I am no longer soft. And if you dared to ask, how do I feel about this? Someone would gently remind you that feelings are for people who don't have to carry spears. You'd see it coming, too. You'd watch older boys leave with shaky legs and come back looking like they saw Godin didn't enjoy it. You'd hear the singing from the bush. You'd pretend not to notice the silence that follows. And eventually, you'd start to wonder, when's my turn? Then one day, someone taps your shoulder. An elder, maybe two. No explanation, no prep. Just a nod that says, pack your dignity. You won't need anything else. Maybe you're 14. Maybe 10. Maybe still missing your front teeth, which makes this next part a bit ironic. You don't pack a bag. You don't say goodbye. You're just taken out into the bush, the in-between space. Childhood ends here, not with a whimper, but with ceremonial shouting and possibly a mildly traumatic circumcision. Your name might even change. Your posture definitely will. And there's no opting out. Not unless you want to spend the rest of your life being called that one who ran. Uninitiated, untouchable, unmarriageable. A spiritual draft that was started, panicked, and closed without saving. So you go, and the village waits. Because when or if you return, you'll be different. Scarred, yes, but that's not a flaw. That's the whole point. And those scars, they're just the prologue. Because here's the thing, your suffering isn't yours alone. It's not a private affair tucked away behind gauze and polite nods. No, in this world, pain is performed. It's witnessed. It's narrated in song, in dance, in sidelong glances from your grandmother, who's already humming the rhythm of your endurance before the blade even touches skin. You're not just proving something to yourself, you're proving something to everyone. That you're brave, that you're silent, that you're worthy. The entire village is watching elders sitting like statues carved from memory, siblings gripping gourds tighter than usual, and children peeking through reed fences wondering how many cuts until you cry. And whether they'll cry too, when it's their turn. In many communities across precolonial Africa like among the Bemba, the Mand, or the Samburu, initiation wasn't just a passage, it was a spectacle, a declaration shouted without words. You weren't just becoming a man, you were becoming their man, a man of this clan, this soil, this story, and every drop of blood said so. No hospital, no anesthesia, just the sky above you and dust below you. Maybe you're kneeling on a mat, maybe you're standing straight, hands bound or clenched behind your back, not to stop you from running, but to give you something to hold on to when the fire rises through your nerves and you remember you're not supposed to scream. Because screaming, that would ruin everything. You see, Silence is your status. Stillness is your statement. Boys who flinch are boys forever. But boys who don't, well, they get remembered. Among the Dinka elders would make deep incisions across the forehead 6-7, sometimes more straight through the skin to the bone. Blood runs, flies come, and no one moves to help. If they do, the ritual loses its power. You must endure, publicly, visibly, cleanly, and it's not cruelty. That's the part outsiders always misunderstand. This isn't hazing, it's not abuse, it's not a punishment. It's a ritual technology for crafting identity. A way to say, I suffered, I didn't break, I am no longer a child. And people treat you differently for it. The moment the cuts are made or the beatings are finished, or the teeth are gone, something shifts. Women lower their eyes. Men nod slowly. Children stare with that mixture of envy and fear that only sacred suffering can inspire. You have become something branded, not by a corporation, not by a culture of likes and filters, but by a knife held by someone who's done this before, and someone who knows exactly where to cut to make a boy disappear. The proof is now written in your skin. It can't be taken back. You can't Photoshop it. You can't deny it when you're older. These aren't just marks. They are the receipt for your manhood. Proof of purchase paid in pain, signed in silence. And while you're still trying to breathe through what just happened, someone leans in and whispers something older than language. Now you belong. But the blade's not done with you yet. You think the wounds are fresh. Wait until they heal, because that's when they start to mean something. If you'd been born among the Yoruba, the Karo, or the Kanuri, your skin wouldn't just be a body, it'd be a biography. Every ridge, every raised line across your chest, your arms, your face, it would speak. And not in metaphor, in literal, social grammar. People would read you before they even greeted you. Scarification was never just about pen, it was about permanence. And permanence, well, it had to hurt to be believed. You see, ink fades, names are forgotten. But a scar you carry until you're dust. Sometimes, the patterns marked your lineage. Other times, your age group, your region, your clan. In some places, even your spiritual affiliations or life achievements. They were like passport stamps carved into flesh. A way to say who you were, where you belonged, and what you'd already survived. Because in communities where writing was passed through voice and body instead of paper, your skin was the archive. The process, intimate and brutal. A sharpened blade, sometimes bone, sometimes metal, dipped in ash or soot, drawn across the skin with practiced ease. You'd be told not to move. You'd be told to watch the horizon, or a fire, or your father's eyes. Anything but the knife. Movement would ruin the symmetry. Movement would waste the pain. Sometimes they'd cut in rows, clean, parallel lines across the cheeks, the forehead, the chest. Sometimes more elaborate designs, spirals, lattice, maps of memory, carved by someone who learned the patterns from their grandfather and his grandfather before that. The healing was its own ritual. Smoke, salve songs. Women might sing to the boys, not to soothe, but to seal, to mark the moment with witness. Every hour of healing was a test of patience, discipline, restraint, because you couldn't let the wound close too quickly. You had to press ash into it, raise it just enough. Flat scars meant failure. Raised scars meant pride. The result, a living map, not decorative, not aesthetic, sacred, literal. And these marks had power. In the heat of negotiation, in the hush of ritual, in the choosing of a wife, or the allocation of land, your scars spoke before your voice did. They said, I have endured. I am not soft. I do not belong to the world of children. They said, I bled for this name. And even decades later, long after the blade was a memory, and the elder who marked you was bones in the earth, strangers could still read you. You could be halfway across a continent, but one look at your arms, and someone might nod slowly and say, ah, you're from there. And it wasn't just men. Women too were marked, though often for different reasons. Fertility, beauty, marriage. But the meaning, still the same identity. History proof. Because in a world where borders were drawn in dust and shifted with every rain, your skin was the one map no one could erase. But not all initiations left beauty behind. Some left empty space where something used to if you flinched during the scarification. This is where things got worse. Not because you were weak, but because that weakness would now be addressed, personally, repeatedly. See, among the Xhosa, the Southo, the Turkana, and many others, pain wasn't just a gate, it was a hammer. You didn't walk through manhood, you were beaten into it, not metaphorically, not symbolically, with sticks, with whips, with the calloused palms of men who'd been through it, too, and knew just how hard they could strike without killing you. And if you think that sounds harsh, well, you're not wrong, but you're also not understanding it, because this wasn't sadism, it was sculpting. Initiation wasn't only about surviving pain, it was about being seen surviving it. And beatings, they were loud, they echoed, they cracked through the village air like thunder from bones. The elders lined up, or sometimes the other boys, and you, the initiate, stood there bare-backed, barefoot, bare-souled, trying not to tremble. It wasn't just about the blows, it was about your reaction, because each strike didn't just test your body, it tested your posture, your silence, your stillness. One flicker of pain across your face, and someone would click their tongue and say, "He's not ready." They weren't teaching you to fight, they were teaching you not to take it, to hold it, to transform it into something socially useful. Obedience, strength, masculinity, and maybe a little bit of fear, because fear was part of the lesson too. You learned that those above you could inflict pain and that one day, if you made it, you'd carry the same stick. Some societies timed the beatings like music, rhythmic, ritualized. The whip would snap in time with a chant, or a rattle, or the drumming of feet on dry earth. You weren't just being hurt, you were being baptized in a kind of ancestral choreography. Every welter verse in a long, painful hymn. And here's the part no one tells you: there was pride in it. Not just when it was over, but during. Boys would brag later about how they didn't cry, about how they barely blinked, about how the elders' hands slipped and they didn't even flinch. It was a brutal poetry of resilience, and you were expected to memorize it with your body, refusing to be beaten. That wasn't strength, that was cowardice. And if you cried, oh, the memory of that would follow you longer than any scar. Women might laugh, men might shake their heads, children might whisper your name with pity, and still some begged to be beaten again. Not for fun, but because failure in initiation was worse than any stick. Better to bleed twice than walk through life as the boy who couldn't take it once. This wasn't punishment, it was proof that your skin, your nerves, your pride, they belonged not just to you, but to your people. And once the welts faded, if they faded, you'd move on, because the body wasn't the only thing that had to be changed. Sometimes they took part of you with them. Let's say you've survived the blade. You've been beaten, bloodied, and told you're nearly ready. Nearly, because now it's time to give something up. Not a bad habit, not your childish toys, but an actual part of your body. If you'd grown up among the chaga, the yao, or the hadza, you might already know what's coming. You've seen it in the smiles of older boys' gaps in their lower jaws, where teeth used to be. Not from decay, not from accident, from ritual. To be clear, this wasn't cosmetic. No one was trying to improve your bite. In some places, it marked readiness, in others, survival. And in many, it was simply what was done. The lower incisors had to go, not because they were useless, but because they meant something once they were gone. And how were they removed? Well, you'd want to look away now. Imagine sitting in a clearing, knees trembling, but you're not allowed to show it. There's a wooden stick in your mouth, not for biting, but for bracing. An elder stands over you, holding a curved piece of metal, or sometimes just a rock. Another boy holds your head still, and then crack. No anesthesia, no sterilized tools, just force and ceremony. Sometimes it took one blow, sometimes two, sometimes more. If the tooth shattered instead of coming clean, they dug for the roots, with whatever was sharp enough and nearby. The blood comes quickly, the pain arrives even faster, and you're expected to sit through all of it without screaming. Why the teeth? There are theories. In some cases, it was practically easier to feed a dying man through the gap if he couldn't open his mouth. In others, it was symbolic teeth as childhood, removed to make room for manhood. And sometimes, it was simply visibility, a badge you couldn't hide. The result, you'd speak differently, you'd smile differently, you'd eat differently, but most importantly, you'd be different. Girls would see the gap and know. Elders would see it and nod. Strangers would see it and step aside. Because it wasn't just your smile that had changed, it was your status. You were now missing something, and that missing piece meant belonging. You'd catch your reflection later, maybe in a pool, or the polished curve of a gourd, and you'd notice the void. It might shock you at first, but over time, you'd come to love it. That space wasn't empty. It was filled with memory, of sound and sweat, and the deep unspoken knowledge that you'd endured something irreversible. And the irony, while you might have lost a part of yourself, you were finally being seen as whole. But before you can celebrate, they take you away again to the bush, into the dark, into the space where boys go to disappear and emerge as something else entirely. They don't call it exile, but that's what it is. A removal, a disappearance. One day you're there reading from the communal bowl, chasing goats with your brothers, laughing at stories you've heard 1,000 times. The next, you're gone, quietly, without ceremony, because the ceremony is still ahead, and you're not yet the kind of creature worthy of being celebrated. This is the bush, or the initiation camp, or, depending on who you ask, the womb of the world. Not metaphorically. In many pre-colonial African societies, the Bemba of Zambia, the Saldo of Lesotho, the Luo of Kenya, the bush was seen as a liminal zone, sacred, dangerous, alive, a space where boys were hidden from the village, not just to be tested, but to be transformed. No fireside comforts here, no mother's voice, no sisters sneaking you food or wiping your face when you cried. In the bush, you belonged to the elders, to the ancestors, to the spirits that watched the clearing and listened for the sound of weakness. You slept on the ground, ate what was given, woke when ordered, learned quickly that questions were a privilege you hadn't yet earned. Time didn't pass in days, but in ordeals, some physical, some mental, some so subtle you didn't notice you were being reshaped until you caught yourself speaking like the men who brought you here, slowly, deliberately, with a tone that suggested secrets buried beneath every syllable. What did you learn? Everything. And nothing you'd find in a textbook. You learned how to survive in the wild, how to speak in symbols, how to interpret omens, how to hold your emotions like a knife pressed flat against your skin, dangerous only when revealed. They taught you tribal law, moral codes, the mechanics of sex with alarming frankness, and how to chant your ancestors' names without stumbling. Sometimes you awoken in the middle of the night to perform rituals you didn't understand. Sometimes you sat for hours in silence, waiting for a lesson that never came. And that was the lesson. You learned discipline. You learned watchfulness. You learned that your body was no longer yours. It was being trained to house something larger. History, responsibility, adulthood. And through it all, there was a quiet understanding. You are dying. Not physically, symbolically. The boy you were, his name, his habits, his softness, he was being stripped away, not with cruelty, with intention. In many traditions, a new name was given in the bush, a name that only the initiated would know, a name that marked your rebirth. You'd carry it like a shadow, whisper it in your prayers, and just maybe one day pass it to a son, if he proved himself worthy of joining you here. Because the man who returned to the village wasn't the boy who left. He looked the same, but he walked differently. He spoke differently. He had disappeared into the wilderness and come back speaking the language of men. But the lessons weren't over. Because now that you'd endured the dark, it was time to learn how to live in the light without saying a word. There's no chalkboard out here. No desks. No multiple choice exams with sharpened sticks and a quiet prayer to pass. The bush doesn't test you like that. It teaches through repetition, pressure, and performance. And if you want to remember something, you bleed it, you sing it, or you carry it on your back until the meaning sinks through your skin. This is education, yes, but not the kind you'd recognize. Here, you don't memorize facts. You inherit wisdom, carefully, slowly, through ritual. If you'd grown up among the Bemba, for instance, or the Luja, or the Mand, the teachings would begin when your body was sore and your pride had just barely survived the last ordeal. That's when your mind is open, raw, empty of noise, and that's when they start to fill it. But not with lectures. Knowledge arrives in stories, and you're not allowed to interrupt. It comes through proverbs, metaphors, riddles with 10 meanings and 1 lesson. Listen better. There's a song about the crocodile who lost his teeth. There's a dance about the stars who forgot their path. You laugh, but only the first time. Then you realize, they're about you. You're the crocodile. You're the wayward star. And suddenly, nothing is just entertainment anymore. Every gesture is a message, every chore a symbol. When they make you sweep the compound in silence, they're not testing your cleanliness, they're watching your discipline. When they send you to gather firewood with the laziest boy in camp, they're not punishing you, they're watching how you lead, or if you do. And then there are the rituals. Some are terrifying, sitting still as an elder smears ash across your face and mutters words you don't understand. Being blindfolded and led through a forest trail while a horn echoes in the distance signaling nothing and everything. Being made too fast while men circle you in slow dance, chanting names you'll one day be expected to memorize and recite without fault. Some rituals feel absurd. You're told to laugh at a tree, or you're asked to mimic a bird call at midnight. But these, too, have layers. The tree is the elder, the bird is the ancestor. You're learning humility, memory, obedience, and attention to detail all at once. And you can't afford to forget, because no one repeats a lesson twice. You're also learning things you'll never speak of outside these circles. Secrets about the clan, about the spirits, about death, about sex not as conquest, but as responsibility. Fertility wasn't a private affair. It was your future job description, and you'd better get it right. And when you make a mistake because you will, they don't yell, they don't scold, they just watch. And then, maybe, the lesson repeats, but differently, harder, slower. You start to realize you're being shaped, not taught, carved, like a figurine, until what's left is worthy of standing beside the men who came before. You start to move differently, listen more, talk less, and the real test. No one tells you when you've passed, they just nod, once. Because if you've been paying attention, you'll already know. But all this ritual, all this teaching, it would mean nothing without the rule that holds it together. The one thing more important than strength, more sacred than tradition, silence. If you cried, they'd remember, not just the boys, the elders, the women, the spirits, everyone. In this world, silence isn't golden, it's proof that you're ready, that you've learned, that you understand the one rule that binds the entire initiation together. The body may scream, but the mouth must not. Among the newer, the Kosa, the Bajisua cross traditions, scattered like firelight on a dark continent, boys learned early that sound was betrayal. The blade could sing, the whip could crack, but you had to stay quiet, because sound was weakness. And weakness, once seen, couldn't be unsaid. It wasn't just about pain tolerance. It was about spiritual containment. You were becoming a man, and men were vessels of memory, of law, of lineage. A leaky vessel, useless. Silence was the seal, and you had to earn it. There were boys who fainted and were dragged back into the circle. There were boys who vomited but were told to hold their position. There were boys who shook so hard their legs knocked together like dry reeds, and still no one moved to help, not because they didn't care, but because this was the help, and silence was part of the lesson. In the bush, you could go days without speaking, not because you weren't allowed, necessarily, but because the weight of the space demanded it. Every rustle, every crackle, every bird call felt like a voice more worthy than yours, and you began to understand. If the ancestors wanted noise, they'd have made the drums louder. Some initiates were punished for speaking out of turn. Others were mocked. A few were sent back, uninitiated, not because they lacked courage, but because they couldn't hold their tongue, because they laughed at the wrong moment, because they asked too many questions, because they didn't understand that the most powerful words are the ones unsaid. You'd learn to breathe differently, shallower. You'd learn how to cry internally, with your jaw locked and your eyes staring forward. Tears could fall, sure, but no wailing, no begging, no pleas. Among the Kosa, it was said that an initiated boy should be able to lie perfectly still during circumcision, without flinching, that even the flicker of an eyebrow was cause for shame. And when he returned to the village, people wouldn't ask, "Did it hurt?" They'd ask, "Did he cry?" Because if he didn't, he was a man. And if he did, well, he'd never hear the end of it. Not from his peers, not from his children, not even from the wind, which has a cruel way of repeating things. But silence wasn't just stoicism, it was preparation, for negotiation, for leadership, for battle, for the long, quiet responsibilities of adulthood. A man who speaks too quickly is a danger. A man who can't sit with discomfort is unreliable. Silence taught you how to wait, how to listen, how to withhold. And just maybe, if you became very good at silence, they'd teach you to speak, not with volume but with weight. Because in these traditions, the most feared man in the room wasn't the loud one. It was the one who said nothing until everyone else had. But why all this suffering? Why the scars, the beatings, the missing teeth, the silence? Because the path you're walking isn't just social, it's sacred. It belongs to the gods, and to the ones who came before. And now you're walking exactly where they walked. You're not just enduring this for your clan, or your father's approval, or even your own manhood. You're reenacting something older than anyone here can name. Something passed down not in ink, but in ritual. You're imitating the ancestors, the real ones. The ones who bled before you, starved before you, fasted and wept, and built the world you're standing in. And you don't just honor them, you become them. In many precolonial African societies, the entire structure of initiation was built not for practicality, but for cosmic continuity. Among the Senufo, the Dogon, the Mand, just to name a few, it wasn't enough to simply grow up. You had to relive the origin. You had to be the myth again, wearing your body like a costume stitched from memory. Take the Dogon of Mali. Their boys enter a secret society through a grueling initiation that mirrors not just ancestral suffering, but cosmic order, the birth of the universe itself reenacted in blood, dust, and silence. Each act, each chant, echoes the deeds of the mythical first men. You're not learning about them. You're retracing their footsteps, and it's not always symbolic. In some cases, the scars are placed in the same pattern as those worn by revered figures. The beating rhythms mirror the drum patterns said to have been played during a primordial battle. The dances mimic a god's movement. Every gesture is memory turned muscle. There are no scripts, but everything is choreographed. No actors, but everything is performance. Because your pain isn't personal, it's historical. It's theological. You are temporarily possessed by the past, not haunted, embodied. This imitation isn't optional. It's sacred insurance. If no one suffers like the ancestors, then the chain is broken. And if the chain is broken, who are you? A man without a lineage, a leaf without a root, unthinkable. Sometimes you'd be told the myths directly, around the fire, or during fasting, or in the hush after a particularly brutal test. You'd hear about the first boy who walked into the forest alone, the one who outwitted the snake, the one who carried fire in his mouth and brought it back to the village without burning his tongue. And you'd recognize the story, not because you'd heard it before, but because you just lived it. The trials were never explained ahead of time, only after. That's how they taught you myth, not as fantasy, but as mirror. And here's the quiet brilliance of it. When you returned, you weren't just older, you were storied. You'd become one more verse in the oral archive, something to be whispered about, reenacted, cited. Because you didn't just pass a test, you fulfilled a prophecy, again. And they might never say it to your face, but someone in the village would nod slowly and mutter, just like his grandfather, or his great-grandfather, or the boy who once vanished into the bush and came back with thunder in his voice. But no one walks this path alone. Not really. Because even in silence, the elders are watching. So there you are, bleeding history, radiating silence, carrying the myth of the first man in your kneecaps, and you think, just maybe, you're becoming something sacred. Not so fast, because while you were busy embodying the cosmos, someone was watching. Actually, everyone was watching. And by everyone, I mean a jury of elders so ancient and opinionated they make time itself look unqualified. You thought you were reenacting the gods. They thought you were slouching. That's the thing about ancestral imitation. It comes with ancestral surveillance. There is no sacred trial without a panel of old men with unimpressed faces and decades of ritual gossip loaded in their mental crossbows. They don't just supervise, they scrutinize. You are being evaluated not on what you do, but on what it means. You bowed too fast during the greeting chant, clearly impatient. You held eye contact with the wrong elder for a second too long. Arrogant, you flinched when they mentioned castration, weakness in the lineage, and don't expect feedback. Elders operate on mystery and muttering. The best you'll get is a grunt, maybe a raised eyebrow if you really mess up. They speak in coded phrases like, "The river doesn't carry every branch," which sounds poetic until you realize it means you're not going to make it. And they remember everything. These are men who can't recall where they left their sandals, but will recount with photographic clarity how your father once sneezed during the honeyroot blessing and doomed 3 harvests. They'll debate your every gesture like it's state policy. They don't need to agree only to pass judgment, and when they do, it's not democratic. One disapproving elder can override a chorus of nods just by saying something cryptic like, "Even the antelope dances before it dies." So what do? You perform. You endure. You pretend you don't notice the way they whisper after each ritual. You start second-guessing the angle at which you hold your water bowl. You begin to understand that being watched is part of the initiation, not just for discipline, for memory. Because they're not just watching to see if you'll fail. They're watching to see if you'll become worth remembering. And if you do well, if they approve subtly, silently, maybe with the faintest nod, then congratulations. You've passed the test behind the test. But don't celebrate just yet. Because now that you've entered the realm of men, it's time to find out what that actually means and how the balance of suffering isn't quite as evenly distributed as they'd like you to believe. So, you've limped your way through the bush, endured pain, silence, and several elders who look like they were carved from baobab bark, and now you've emerged, allegedly a man. Cue the applause, cue the ceremonial porridge, cue absolutely no rest. Because here's the next layer of the onion. Your suffering comes with a gender clause, and spoiler alert, it's not exactly feminist. See, in most pre-colonial African societies, gender wasn't something you just had, it was a job description. And the job of being a man, oh, it's straightforward. You're expected to endure agony, wear it like a necklace, then immediately provide livestock, leadership, military service, and at least one heir with an unusually symmetrical face. No pressure. And while the rites of manhood involved public mutilation and metaphysical existentialism, the girls, well, their path wasn't exactly a picnic either, but let's just say it had different branding. In some cultures, the girls' rites were cloaked in themes of beauty, fertility, and whispered warnings about keeping the fire inside. For boys, fire was meant to explode out of every orifice, preferably while holding a spear. Your training involved fasting, beatings, teeth removal, and being called a disappointment by 3 men named after animals. The girls were learning songs, ceremonial grinding techniques, and how to make eye contact with a suitor without triggering a cattle negotiation. And yet somehow you're still the one expected to defend the village from raiders, construct a granary, settle disputes, and, if time allows, solve metaphysical dilemmas. What is honor? All before sunset. But wait, it gets better. Because while you're recovering from a ritual that involved your nerve endings being turned into drawn lines, you're also being told you're now ready to take a wife. A wife, singular, ideally, realistically, depends on your livestock count and tolerance for domestic chaos. But don't get excited. This isn't about romance. There's no courtship, no roses, no what's your favorite constellation, mine's Orion. You're not being trained to love. You're being trained to provide, to produce, to perform. And make no mistake, every woman in the village knows what you just went through. She's seen the scars. She's heard the chants. She knows you cried during the ash ritual, even if you swore you didn't. And she is not impressed, because her mother went through worse. At dawn while cooking breakfast, with a baby strapped to her back. The truth is, the gender roles weren't symmetrical. They were stacked like ceremonial stones, one on top of the other, slightly crooked, but nobody dared move them. And if you even hinted at wanting to question the system, an elder would materialize from the shadows and say, even the sun follows its path. Translation, shut up and herd the goats. So yes, you've been initiated. You're a man now. You can take a wife, defend your people, and die gloriously if needed. But don't expect a standing ovation. You're not sacred. You're useful. Now hurry up, because marriage is coming. Your family wants to see returns on their investment, and someone's already negotiating your bride price over a bowl of beer. You made it. You survived the cuts, the fasting, the lectures delivered in parables, so vague they might have been about goats, or God, or your future. Doesn't matter. You didn't cry in public, and that's the only credential that counts. Which means, drumroll, please, you're ready to be, as in, attached for life to another person with zero prior conversation, questionable mutual attraction, and a shared understanding that this isn't about love. Darling, it's about logistics. In most pre-colonial African societies, marriage wasn't what we'd now call intimate. It was more like a multi-generational merger between 2 small human corporations. You weren't picking a soulmate, you were picking someone whose father had enough goats to not embarrass your aunties. Romantic gestures, The grandest display of affection in your toolkit is not falling asleep during bride price negotiations. You stand there, quiet and dignified, while your uncles argue over how many chickens your future happiness is worth. If you're lucky, you'll end up with someone you've made awkward eye contact with once at a millet harvest. If you're unlucky, she's your cousin, and that's not just acceptable, it's encouraged. And here's the truly beautiful part, you're still a teenager, 16 maybe, emotionally still reeling from watching your own teeth get knocked out, but culturally expected to build a hut, plant cassava, and raise a dynasty. Nobody cares if you're ready, you have to be. Because manhood without marriage is like a drum without skin, hollow, suspicious, and definitely not fit to play at the festival. You need a wife to prove you're a full adult, someone to call you father of even before there's a child, someone to cook, grind, carry, endure, possibly remind you how much less impressive you are than her brothers. But don't worry, this marriage is functional, it's practical, it's built to last, not on passion, but on performance. You bring the labor, she brings the lineage. And between you, there will eventually be children, preferably male, strong, and quiet, or at least able to survive an ant bite without a dramatic scene. And should anything go wrong, should the crops fail, or the baby arrive with a suspicious forehead, you'll be blamed. Not because it's your fault, but because you're the man. And men, as previously established, are useful, not fragile. Of course, if your wife leaves you for a more handsome herder, or if your in-laws decide your hut is improperly ventilated, no one intervenes. You just quietly absorb the shame like a clay pot absorbs water slowly, until it cracks. But hey, you're married now. You've made it, sort of. Because now the real game begins, proving you're not just a man on paper, but a father of the people, a pillar of the lineage, a walking embodiment of reliability. And you'll need to do it while navigating rumors, rivalries, and the very real possibility that one of your childhood friends is now trying to seduce your wife, for worse, replace you in the clan hierarchy. So, you're scarred, married, and finally allowed to sit at the men's council without being immediately told to fetch water. You're feeling good, accomplished, divine, even, but don't relax, because now, the stakes go from physical to existential. You see, in many precolonial African societies, from the manned regions of West Africa to the pastoral communities of East Africa, initiation was never just about endurance. It was about status, and status is fragile, like a clay pot, or your pride. One misstep, and the whole thing shatters in front of the entire village, and they will watch. Because here, everyone remembers everything. Did you whimper during scarification? It's now a nickname. Did your wife leave after 2 moons? There's a song about it. Did you fail to build your granary straight? Children are reenacting the collapse with dramatic flair behind your hut as we speak. There's no such thing as just a mistake. Every error becomes a parable. Every stumble gets converted into folklore. You trip over your own sandals during a ceremony, and 2 seasons later someone's cousin will be warning their child, do not walk like the man who angered the gods during yam season. Social success here is like balancing a pot of water on your head, while people throw riddles and livestock negotiations at you. And if you fall, you don't just lose water, you lose face. Initiation failure was rare, but when it happened, it was brutal. A boy who ran during the ritual, a man who cried, a teenager who fainted mid-beating and had to be revived with herbal tea and mild shaming. He might never marry, might never inherit land, might never be allowed to slaughter a goat unsupervised again. And the judgment didn't fade. You could be 60 with 4 wives and a compound full of grandchildren, and someone would still bring up how you once flinched during the cucumber blessing in your youth. You are forever a walking cautionary tale, a moral fable in human form. But if you pastorally didn't just gain adulthood, you gained glory, a special kind, quiet, but potent. The kind that makes people lean forward when you speak. The kind that gets you invited to closed-door elder meetings. The kind that makes young boys stare at your scars like they're maps to manhood, because they are. Success meant more than respect. It meant access to leadership, to land, to the metaphysical backstage of the community. You became a link in the chain, one more strong hand gripping the past while reaching toward the future. So yes, the rituals were brutal, but the social currency they offered, practically divine. And still, no matter how well you played, the game time marched on. Empires shifted, missionaries arrived, borders changed, and suddenly, the rituals that defined you were being questioned, undermined, outlawed, sanitized, because even pain, it turns out, has an expiration date. So you've earned your scars. You've been beaten into manhood, married off like surplus cattle, survived social annihilation by sheer stoicism, and just when you're finally able to enjoy a quiet beer under a mango tree without anyone questioning your manhood, here comes colonialism, and with it, clergymen, administrators with wide hats, wide mustaches, and absolutely no tolerance for a perfectly good circumcision ritual done under moonlight and the appropriate amount of ancestral chanting. In the span of a few decades, entire systems that had held villages together for centuries, rituals, initiations, silence, suffering, were dismissed as barbaric, banned, replaced with hymns and chalkboards, and something called childhood development, which mostly involved sitting still and pretending not to hear spirits. It was a full-scale cultural audit. Colonial authorities, missionaries, and bureaucrats arrived with a singular goal: civilize. Translate that however you want it, usually meant stop bleeding in public. Initiation rites were suddenly criminalized or mocked. Sacred spaces turned into missionary outposts. Elders were sidelined, priests replaced them, and instead of learning how to survive a lion encounter, boys were taught how to conjugate verbs in a language that sounded like coughing politely. Among the Sado, the Igbo, the Kikuyu, everywhere what had once been a grand passage into adulthood became a quiet, confused erasure. Boys who would have carried scars were now carrying notebooks, which is fine if you're planning to write a dissertation about your feelings, but not terribly helpful if you're being spiritually hunted by your grandfather's ghost for skipping the thigh-cutting ritual. Of course, not everything vanished. In some places, the rituals just went underground. Secret camps, whispered chants, nighttime ceremonies carried out when the local inspector wasn't looking. Like spiritual contraband, you couldn't not do them. You'd risk the ancestors showing up in your dreams and asking why you still had all your teeth. And today, it's complicated. In urban areas, many initiation rites have faded or mutated, replaced by boarding school, bar mitzvahs, awkward group chats, or the deeply spiritual experience of trying to file taxes for the first time. But in rural pockets, the old rites persist, sometimes with modern tweaks, a dash of disinfectant, a lecture on consent, maybe a WhatsApp group for scheduling. And people argue, of course they do. Critics raise questions: bodily autonomy, trauma, unnecessary suffering, and those are real questions, deep ones, the kind you ask when no one's watching and you're not wearing your clan sash. But others defend the rites, not because they enjoy the pain, but because they remember what it meant to belong, to be seen, to be broken. Yes, but rebuilt stronger, scarred with purpose. Because once you've tasted a world where manhood was earned, not assumed, it's hard to take seriously the version that comes with a learner's permit and a scented candle. Still, everything changes. Even the gods, if you wait long enough. And the marks, they fade, but they never vanish. Because when someone lifts their sleeve, or smiles with a gap where a tooth used to be, or simply sits with that quiet dignity that only comes from surviving things, no one should have to explain. That's when you see it. The legacy still lives in the flesh. You might think it's over. The rites, the beatings, the whispered threats from an elder who smells like smoke and secrets. The world's changed, right? There are smartphones now, therapists, university courses on performing masculinities in post-colonial contexts. And yet one look at an old scar, and the story unravels. Because the body never forgets. Among the elders who still sit cross-legged under the same tree their fathers sat under, and among the young men who now wear jeans but still carry the same silences, the legacy lingers, in raised skin, in missing teeth, in the way someone walks into a room and you can tell they've been through something that wasn't just difficult, it was ancestral. Even in cities, even in diasporas, you'll find them, quiet men with names nobody pronounces right anymore, but who still have 3 cuts across the forehead that map a village erased from Google Earth. Men who smile carefully, because they know what it means to bleed for identity and also how easy it is to become a museum piece, misunderstood and mislabeled. And it's not just scars, it's the way they raise their sons, the way they don't interrupt, the way they wait just long enough before answering, as if weighing every word for ritual significance. Or maybe just remembering how silence once saved their life. It's in the rituals that survived. Maybe no one's cutting with obsidian blades anymore, but the ceremony of becoming still exists. Maybe it's done in sneakers, maybe there's a speech, maybe someone live streams it. But beneath the surface, the blueprint remains, and that blueprint is carved deep, in memory, in flesh. in how entire communities still organize around the idea that manhood is earned, not assumed, that identity is proven, not posted, that pain, real, terrible, beautiful pain, was once the doorway to dignity. Of course, not everyone romanticizes it. Some carry bitterness with their scars, some never quite healed right physically or otherwise. There are wounds that didn't become wisdom, just trauma, and those are real too. But ask any elder who's lived long enough to see his ritual outlawed and his grandson rolling his eyes at tradition, what he remembers most. He won't say the pain, he'll say belonging. Because even if the gods are quieter now, even if the bush has been bulldozed and the ritual chants replaced by playlists, there's still a kind of reverence in a body marked by passage, a kind of wisdom that doesn't tweet well, but carries weight in a room. And maybe one day, someone will point at your scar, or your son's, or a photo on a museum wall that completely misunderstands what it's looking at, and they'll ask, "Did it hurt?" And you'll smile, slow and tired, and say, "Only when I remembered what it meant." The car was light blue. That's what people forget, or never notice. A powdery, almost childlike blue, parked neatly at the corner of a Saigon intersection on June 11th, 1963. It looked like any other car, really. The monk who stepped out of it did not. He moved slowly, not like a man hesitating, but like someone following steps already rehearsed in dreams. Robes folded, spine straight, Thich Quang Jisi sat cross-legged on the street, as if about to begin a morning chant. Someone placed a cushion beneath him, one final mercy for a body about to become an offering. The gasoline came next. 2 5-gallon cans, poured with the calm efficiency of a sacred rite. No urgency, no whispers, just the sound of liquid slapping pavement, soaking cloth, and then a match. There are few human faces the world remembers centuries after they've turned to ash, but his is one of them. Not because of what burned, but how. While the fire consumed everything, skin, muscle, robe, breath, he didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't move. People around him did. A man threw himself to the ground, beating it with his fists. Others sobbed, staggered, yelled. One monk held a string of beads and chanted louder, but Thich Quang Jisi didn't waver. His silhouette held its lotus shape, even as the flames danced wild. Reporters would later call it the most shocking thing they'd ever witnessed. But he wasn't shocked. He'd left a letter behind, not a suicide note, but a sermon. In it, he asked nothing for himself. He didn't even mention his own death. He only pleaded for religious freedom and understanding, the kind his government refused to grant. And in that one act, he did what years of negotiation and protest hadn't. He drew the world's eyes, not through violence, but through stillness. A fire with no panic, no chaos, just quiet agony turned into spectacle. The image, taken by Malcolm Brown, spread like a relic in the machine age. Newspapers printed it. Politicians condemned it. Poets couldn't stop writing about it. Even President Kennedy reportedly said, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion." And yet, few understood what they were seeing. Because to the West, it looked like a suicide, a horror, a political tantrum dressed in saffron robes. But within the Buddhist tradition he followed, it was something else entirely. A ritual act, a conscious offering, a combustion not of despair, but of discipline. The question is, what kind of belief lets a man set himself on fire and remain completely still? It doesn't begin with flames. It begins with stories of bodhisattvas who burned their bodies to light the path for others. Tales written not in smoke, but in ink, centuries before Quang Jisi ever touched a match. They said he didn't scream, but he wasn't the first. Centuries before Thich Quang Jisi became the photograph no one could forget, others had done the same thing, not for headlines, not for protest, but for something far more abstract, merit. In the world of Mahayana Buddhism, there's a long, uncomfortable intimacy with fire, and it didn't start on a Saigon street. It started in the scriptures. The Lotus Sutra, revered like gospel across East Asia, tells the story of a bodhisattva who, upon encountering the Buddha, lights his own body on fire as an offering, not out of desperation, but as the highest act of devotion. 10,000 years of burning, it says. Imagine that. Not even metaphor, but religious blueprint. The body, in this framework, is kindling, something you give up the way others might give flowers or incense. And this wasn't just poetic imagery. Monks believed it, copied it, enacted it. The sacred text didn't whisper, it instructed. In 9th century China, state records and temple inscriptions speak of monks who sliced off fingers one by one, cauterizing them in temple flames. A monk might light his arm during night prayers, his body casting shadows on walls painted with stories just like his own. Pain, you see, wasn't the point. Purity was. Fire didn't punish, it clarified. It was a spiritual solvent, burning away delusion, ego, attachment, until only intention remained. So when Thch Quang Gc sat down with a canister of gasoline, he wasn't improvising. He was stepping into a lineage, one that believed martyrdom could be meditative, that stillness could scream louder than any megaphone, and that the body wasn't the final truth, just the wax around the flame. It's not that Buddhists loved fire. It's that they respected what it could do when wielded by someone who had nothing left to burn but themselves. And once you accept that the body is impermanent, fleeting, already halfway to ash, the question changes. Not why burn, but why not? That's the irony. Of course, in the West, self-immolation is read as crisis, a scream for help. In Buddhist cosmology, it's often framed as the opposite, a final, perfected silence, a vow. And if burning yourself alive still feels extreme, well, you haven't yet seen what they did to prepare for it. No one wakes up one morning and casually decides to become a torch. The path to that moment, that quiet, crackling stillness inside the fire, begins long before the match is struck. It begins in silence, in fasting, in the kind of meditative training that turns the body from a liability into an instrument. If the flames are to be endured without movement, the body must already have been relinquished. In certain monastic traditions, especially those rooted in East Asia, purification meant stripping down everything, not just possessions, but appetites, impulses, the twitchy reflexes of ordinary flesh. Some monks prepared for months, even years. They ate only one meal a day. They renounced speech. They practiced remaining motionless in unbearable positions, learning to stay so still that even the pain forgot about them. And it wasn't just about resisting the body, it was about seeing through it. Buddhist philosophy doesn't exactly treat the body as the enemy, it just treats it as a distraction, a flickering lamp in a windstorm, useful while it works, but never mistaken for the source of light. So when a monk sits down in front of the world, drenched in gasoline, and closes his eyes, he's already gone, in a sense. What you're seeing is not a man dying, you're seeing a teaching, a gesture refined over centuries. The skin, the nerves, the blood, they're part of the message, not the tragedy. And here's the part that twists the stomach. Pain wasn't always avoided. In some sects, pain was folded into the ritual on purpose. It was the grit that polished the soul. The same way some Christian mystics wore hair shirts or flagellated themselves in the name of grace. Some monks treated suffering as a gate, a narrow one, yes, but one that led straight into clarity. Fire, in that context, wasn't violence, it was medicine. And unlike weapons or swords, fire doesn't favor anyone. It treats the liar and the enlightened the same. Which is why, for the monks who truly believed, enduring the flames without flinching proved something. Not just to others, but to themselves. Because if your body's illusion, and your ego is illusion, and even your pain is illusion, then what's left? That question became useful, painfully useful, in moments where religion and politics collided, where the inner vow met the outer regime, and where lighting the body became the only language left. By the 1960s, Vietnam had become a theater where ancient vows met modern tanks. And Thich Quang Gcc's burning body wasn't just a personal act, it was a pointed, incandescent indictment. Under President Eng Hun Diem, a Catholic leader in a Buddhist-majority nation, monasteries were raided, flags were banned, and monks were beaten in the streets. The government called for order. The monks answered with fire. Because when every petition is ignored, and every peaceful gathering ends in blood, you don't send another letter, you light the match. Quang Jc wasn't alone for long. Others followed. More monks, more gasoline, more photographs. The West kept watching, half mesmerized, half repulsed, and the de-arm regime began to crack, not under the weight of rebellion, but under the unbearable optics of serenity on fire. Self-immolation by then had become something terrifyingly effective, not because it shocked, though it did, but because it refused to play by the usual rules. These weren't assassins or soldiers. They weren't trying to kill anyone. They were trying to die. Beautifully, unarguably, unignorable, and it worked. But the practice didn't stay in Vietnam. Half a century later, it reappeared on the roof of the world. In Tibet, a land where Buddhism saturates everything from government to goat herding, monks once again turned to fire. This time, in protest against Chinese occupation and the slow, surgical erasure of Tibetan culture. From 2009 onward, the pattern returned. Young monks and nuns walking calmly to intersections, pouring petrol over themselves, and sitting down to burn. No violence, no chants, just silence and flame. Chinese authorities called it terrorism. Tibetan exiles called it martyrdom. The monasteries, caught in the middle, sometimes condemned the acts publicly, while quietly mourning them with prayer flags and hidden shrines. But whether in Saigon or Lhasa, the message was always the same. We have no weapons but our bodies, and we will make them impossible to ignore. Of course, fire isn't just a spectacle. It's a process, a transformation. And before anyone walks into it, there's a kind of choreography, a preparation so intimate, it borders on surgical. Because this isn't impulsive, it's ritual. And ritual, in Buddhism, never starts with fire. It starts with stillness. By the time a monk is ready to burn, the decision has stopped feeling like a decision. There's no last-minute panic, no trembling hands. The choice was made long before, in fasting cells, in midnight meditations, in the quiet refusal to eat more than was necessary, speak more than was kind, or exist more than was bearable. Self-immolation isn't improvised, it's choreographed, down to the fold of the robe and the way the legs cross beneath it. Weeks before the fire, they begin withdrawing. Food becomes ash in the mouth, water, a luxury. The body thins, not from sickness, but from shedding. Not just pounds, but preferences, desires, doubts. The self, hollowed out like a gourd, becomes the vessel. And then, the purification, ritual bathing, offerings to the altar, letters to family. Sometimes a final chant, sometimes only silence. The gasoline is never handled carelessly. It's poured slowly, often by another monk. The cloth absorbs it, so does the skin. And then they wait. Eyes closed, breathing slowed. The match is struck, not always by their own hand. There are reports, whispered and unconfirmed, of monks who trained themselves not to blink in the face of flame, who could remain upright for minutes after the body had ceased breathing. Some say it's discipline, others, grace. Either way, the result is unnerving. Death without struggle, suffering without resistance, fire that illuminates more than it consumes. Witnesses often report the same detail. The posture never collapses. Even as the robes ignite, even as the air warps and crackles, the monk stays seated, a silhouette against the blaze. The bones don't scatter, the flesh doesn't thrash. It's as if the fire finds nothing to fight against. And maybe that's the difference between spectacle and sacrament. Spectacle resists, sacrament yields, but not everyone approves. Even within Buddhist circles, these acts cause friction, between reverence and regulation, between tradition and trauma. And what happens after the flames, to the body, to the memory, to the monastery, is just as contested as what happened before. Not all monasteries celebrate a monk who turns himself into fire. Some don't even acknowledge it. In public, Buddhist institutions often walk a tightrope. On one side, the undeniable lineage, ancient texts, sacred examples, ritual precision. On the other, modern scrutiny, government pressure, and a fundamental unease with death as protest. Some abbots issue quiet condemnations, others hold silent vigils. A few say nothing at all, as if the act were a ghost passing through the temple, best left unspoken. This isn't new. Even during the Tang dynasty, imperial edicts tried to regulate body sacrifice, fearing its contagious boldness. The court appreciated devotion up to a point. Lighting one's arm during prayer was considered admirable, but full-body combustion, that was harder to frame on a scroll. Too extreme, too public, too uncontrollable. And so, A kind of doctrinal discomfort settled in. Monastic codes shifted. Fire rituals were discouraged, then buried under euphemisms. Offerings of intense merit. Demonstrations of transcendence. Words that smoothed over the screams that never came. Yet still, the acts continued. Why? Because while institutions are slow, devotion isn't. Individual monks, often young, often politically aware, often shaped by personal loss, kept returning to fire. Not to escape life, but to fulfill it, to become the sermon others refused to hear. Sometimes they left letters, sometimes not. Sometimes they told their masters, sometimes they vanished in the early morning, robes folded neatly, bowl cleaned, mattress smoothed. No hint of drama, just quiet departure, a ritual unto itself. What remains is ambiguity. In some temples, a photo of the burned monk is placed near the altar. In others, his name is never spoken again. Some are cremated again, despite the irony. Others are buried with fragments of the charred cushion they died on. One monastery in Vietnam reportedly kept the monk's heart, unburned, encased in glass, worshipped not as a relic of pain, but of control, of will. And in this contradiction, praise wrapped in disapproval, sainthood denied, but secretly longed for, one begins to see that fire was never just an act, it was a debate. Because if the monk felt no pain, was it violence? If he welcomed death, was it suicide? And if no one screamed, was it still protest? Those are questions that institutions can't always answer, but the body can, or rather what's left of it. And in that silence, in that final stillness, lies something even more radical than flame. The fire roars, the crowd panics, the body blackens, but the monk says nothing, no cries, no begging, not even a grunt. This is what unsettles people most, the stillness within the agony, as if the pain had been invited like an old friend and asked politely to take its shoes off. In most cultures, pain is a conversation. We shout, we sob, we demand help or vengeance. Pain proves we're alive. But for the burning monk, it proves something else entirely, that he's already gone. Not dead, but detached, beyond flesh, beyond nerves, beyond needing to flinch. There's power in that silence. It doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't argue, it doesn't even accuse, it just exists, unbearably, unblinking, and forces everyone else to fill the space with meaning. Reporters call it bravery, officials call it hysteria, fellow monks call it awakening. But the silence itself remains blank, like a mirror held up to the viewer's face. It's not a passive silence. It's aggressive in its restraint, the same way a glacier is aggressive, the same way a corpse is political. Refusing to scream becomes a language, and not a soft one. It's brutal in its refusal to comfort. And what makes it unbearable isn't the fire. It's that the monk isn't asking for help. He doesn't want to be saved. The act isn't a plea, it's a conclusion. And it leaves everyone else scrambling to make sense of something that isn't interested in being explained. In that way, the silence is louder than the fire, because pain, when embraced this fully, doesn't disappear, it transcends. It becomes theater, then myth, then theology, and sometimes it becomes karma. Because in Buddhist thought, this isn't just a final act, it's a transaction, a gift, a karmic offering flung into the cosmic bank account, with interest paid in lives and rebirths to come. A body turned to ash, not as a protest, but as a kind of spiritual investment. One that doesn't end with death, it only begins there. To the casual observer, it ends with smoke. But for the monk, that's where it starts. In the karmic imagination of Mahayana Buddhism, death, real death, conscious, chosen, disciplined, is not an endpoint. It's a gesture folded into eternity. A flaming body isn't merely disappearing. It's planting something, a seed of merit, sprouting in realms unseen. In this logic, the more complete the sacrifice, the more radiant its ripple. There's a term for this, paramet, the perfections of spiritual practice. And at the top of that ladder is DNA, paramet, the perfection of giving. Most people settle for charity. Some offer time, or food, or knowledge. But the highest expression, in some texts, is the total offering of self. Flesh, bone, heartbeat, the whole architecture, dismantled with intention. In the Avatasaka Skra, a bodhisattva offers his body to feed a starving tigress. Elsewhere, monks burn fingers, tongues, or entire limbs before altars. believing that such acts purify not only themselves but the karmic entanglements of entire communities. So when a monk self-immolates, the gesture isn't meant to be pitied. It's meant to be felt like heat from a sacred lamp. The body becomes a votive candle in a temple too large to see. The pain isn't meaningless, it's currency. Burned flesh becomes a gift to the Buddha, to the Sangha, to the world. And like all gifts in Buddhism, the value lies not in the thing, but in the detachment behind it. It must be given cleanly, without resentment, without ego, without a whisper of "look at me." This, perhaps, is why self-immolation has always lived on the edge of orthodoxy, admired but feared, celebrated but rarely endorsed. It flirts too closely with glory. It risks becoming spectacle. And yet, when done purely, it's considered one of the most powerful offerings possible. A karmic detonation that echoes far beyond the skin, and sometimes far beyond the monastery, because the modern world has cameras, and those cameras catch everything: the silence, the smoke, the serenity. And once recorded, the ritual changes shape. It leaves the realm of the sacred and enters the realm of the global gaze, where karma meets clickbait, where devotion meets digestion, and where the monk's final act is torn apart, pixel by pixel, by people who have never missed a meal. When Thich Quang GC burned, the photo circled the globe before his ashes cooled, but the longer it floated, the more it changed shape. In Vietnam, it was martyrdom. In the US, it was strategy. In some corners, it was madness, dressed in saffron. Everyone saw the same flames. No one agreed on what they meant. And that's the curse of the camera. It freezes ritual in time, but strips it of context. Self-immolation becomes content. It's uploaded, clipped, hashtagged, commented on by people sipping coffee, an act honed over centuries, refined in silence, now captioned with outrage or awe, depending on the algorithm. It's not that the devotion is lost, it's flattened. What was once a transmission of karmic merit becomes an aesthetic. Tragic, yes, but striking. A visual too intense to ignore, and too complex to truly absorb. The monk becomes symbol, then symbol becomes commodity. In some cases, their faces end up on protest posters in countries they never visited. In others, they become t-shirts, stickers, TikTok slideshows, and yet, somehow, the power survives. Because something in us still recoils, still goes quiet when we see a man on fire who doesn't flinch. But modernity has a way of softening even the unbearable. Once the flames fade, narratives rush in to patch the silence. Was it political despair, mental illness, an act of war, of peace, of ego? The mystery becomes intolerable. So the world assigns motives, picks sides, debates ethics, all while the original act sits smoldering, uninterested in being decoded. Meanwhile, back in the temples, the real ones, where the air smells like candle smoke and boiled rice, monks still debate the same question. Was it right? Was it pure? Did it honor the teachings? Or did it become too much about being seen? Because in Buddhist ritual, the act isn't over when the body dies. It lingers, in relics, in karma, in consequences, and in the ways the community chooses to remember or not. Some bury what's left. Some display it in glass. Some chant the monk's name every morning. Others avoid speaking it at all, fearing it'll catch fire in the wrong mouth. Because what remains isn't just ashes, it's questions. And one of the strangest is this: what happens when a body burns for truth, and the world clicks like? The fire always ends. Eventually, the body collapses, the skin flakes, the bones darken, then fall inward like a house giving up its frame. Smoke drifts upward, casual and indifferent, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And then comes the part no one knows how to handle. What do you do with what's left? In Vietnam, after Thich Quang GCC's body was cremated a second time, yes, a second time, his heart refused to burn. It was retrieved from the ashes, still intact, not metaphorically, physically, entire. Officials called it a biological fluke. Devotees called it a miracle. Today, it sits in a glass case in Huck, glowing faintly under temple lights, worshipped like a saint's jawbone in medieval Europe. Elsewhere, the remains are treated with equal ambivalence. In some monasteries, they're buried quietly, under the shadow of government disapproval. In others, relics are collected: fingernail fragments, charred beads, bits of cloth fused to bone. These are not souvenirs, they're touchstones of will, of a life distilled to its hottest moment. But relics don't answer questions, they only sharpen them. What kind of belief system breeds this kind of sacrifice? Not once, but repeatedly, across centuries, across cultures, across regimes. What does it mean that someone can sit in gasoline and call it grace? And what does it mean that others gather afterward, not to cry, but to bow? In the end, the body becomes a kind of liturgy. Its absence speaks. Its destruction teaches. The monk never shouts, but his absence keeps echoing, filling halls where no one moves without bowing first. And maybe that's the real ritual, not the burning, but the remembering. The way each new generation stares into that silence and asks, could I ever believe in something that much? Could I ever let go that completely? Could I ever sit in flame and not flinch? The fire doesn't answer. It never has. It only illuminates the space where answers used to be, and then it goes out. They didn't walk. They paraded 100 men, stripped to the waist, moving in rows 2 or 3 across, their backs already weeping blood beneath rough white linen hoods. One hand gripped the scourge, 3 cords of knotted leather tipped with bone or iron. The other beat their chests. In some towns, they dragged coffins. In others, they sang. Latin verses twisted through broken teeth, echoing down cobbled alleys already stained in dried red. It was the 13th century's most unforgettable sound, the soft hiss of rope slicing flesh, followed by the wet slap of blood hitting stone. The flagellants had arrived. In the beginning, no one knew what to call them. Pilgrims, penitents, madmen. They appeared unannounced, first in Italy, then in Germany, then like wildfire through the rest of Europe. By the mid-1300s, they had become a moving sermon, one that didn't ask for coins or confessions, one that offered pain in place of prayer. And cities couldn't look away. Shopkeepers left stalls unattended. Nobles watched from balconies, eyes narrowed, arms crossed. Children mimicked the motion in alleyways. Even bishops came outside, just to see. It was like watching guilt incarnate on parade. They moved in silence for long stretches, then burst into chorus, hymns written just for them, bloody lullabies, filled with images of Christ's agony, apocalyptic dread, and the promise that pain, real pain, could clean the soul like nothing else. No sacrament could rival this. No priest could outdo the lash. Some carried placards bearing skulls or crude images of Christ bleeding from every limb. Some bore wounds already rotting with infection, arms trembling from fever. But they kept walking. When they fell, others took their place. The road behind them wasn't just red, it was fragrant with sweat, iron, pus, and devotion. They didn't ask permission. They didn't follow feast days. They had no pope, no bishop, no master. They were ruled only by the rhythm of their own discipline, and the fear that God had already made up his mind. And in those years between famines, plagues, and whispers of apocalypse, who could argue? But this wasn't just hysteria in a hood. It had structure, scripture, theology. The flagellants weren't acting out. They were acting in enacting a faith that had, over centuries, sanctified the idea that suffering could be sacred, and that the best way to get God's attention was to bleed for it. Because behind the spectacle was a belief, one that had taken root long before the first lash was ever swung. A belief that pain could redeem, that agony could purify, that the whip could do what the cross had done. And that belief wasn't born in the street. It came straight from the pulpit. It began, as many bad ideas in history do, with good intentions and a heavy dose of scripture. By the 13th century, Western Christianity had perfected the art of guilt, not the casual, everyday kind, but the cosmic variety. Original sin wasn't a metaphor, it was marrow. Everyone was born broken, inherited failure in their blood, and the only way forward was through some very creative forms of regret. Entered the theology of pain. Christ, they taught, didn't just die, he suffered spectacularly. Crown of thorns, whip across the back, nails through tendon. The passion wasn't a sad ending, it was the blueprint. If the Son of God bled to redeem the world, what business did any ordinary sinner have seeking comfort? St. Augustine had already laid the groundwork centuries before. Humans were fallen, frail, spiritually soft. Anything good came not from them, but through them, by grace. And grace, as it happened, liked to travel by way of agony. So suffering became currency. The more it hurt, the more sincere it looked. Martyrdom was out of style. No lions left in the Colosseums. But there were always other options. Fasting, kneeling for hours, sleeping on rocks, wearing hair shirts filled with lice, and of course, the lash. Flagellation turned into a kind of theological shortcut, a way to fast-track repentance by beating the sin out of the flesh. Because flesh was the problem, wasn't it? It lusted, it hungered, it aged, it betrayed. Every whip crack across the back was an exorcism of sorts, a way of telling the body, you don't get the final word, and the logic held. If Christ's suffering had redeemed the world, then the echo of that suffering could redeem the individual. The closer the imitation, the deeper the devotion. And nothing said I'm with him opening your own back and walking barefoot through towns with the blood still warm. But it didn't stop at symbolism. Pain wasn't just metaphor, it was medicine. It purified, it sanctified. It sent a message up to heaven that said, I am serious, I am terrified, I will pay in blood. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some theologians winced, others wrung their hands, but none could deny its popularity. Pain was persuasive, and in a world rotting with plague and famine and whispered heresies, the whip offered something tangible: control. You could bleed on purpose, you could suffer by choice, you could do to yourself what God might do anyway, and, just maybe, get ahead of the punishment. Still, even theology needs a spark to catch fire in the streets. Belief alone doesn't fill town squares with the stench of flayed skin. For that, you need panic, and desperation, and a few men willing to walk for miles with open wounds. No one planned it, not really. There wasn't a single founder, a holy decree, or a midnight vision. The flagellants rose the way mold does, quietly, in damp corners where fear had already begun to fester. It started in Perugia, Italy, sometime around the 1260s. A small group of laymen began gathering in public squares, stripping off their shirts, and beating themselves with leather cords, while crying out for God's mercy. The city, reeling from famine and political collapse, didn't blink. If anything, they applauded, because here, finally, was a religious act that didn't cost money. No indulgences, no fat bishops, no need to read Latin, just pain, honest, bleeding pain. And from there, the disease spread, not metaphorically, but quite literally, through the Apennines, into the Germanic states, across the Alps. By the time the 14th century rolled around, the flagellants had become a transnational performance troupe of the damned. But it wasn't until 1348 that they truly caught fire. That year, the Black Death swept into Europe like the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. It came from the east, on fleas, on rats, on ships that docked with too little cargo and too many corpses. In town after town, people died before their names could be carved into stone. Entire villages emptied before a priest could arrive. The church fumbled. Priests died in the same numbers as peasants. Mass graves swallowed the faithful and the unbaptized alike. The sacraments stopped making sense. God, it seemed, had either turned his face away or pressed it to the window and smiled. Enter the flagellants. They arrived in cities reeking of death and promised something no bishop could: a way to fight back. They weren't just mourners, they were warriors of penance, cleansing sin from the streets with blood instead of incense. If the plague was God's punishment, then this endless march of the self-scourged was Europe's loudest apology. Processions grew massive, hundreds of bodies moving like one fevered organism, flaying itself alive to buy time for the rest of the continent. They walked in cycles of 33 1/3 days, one for every year of Christ's life. When they reached a town, they performed the spectacle of guilt and redemption, sung and screamed and soaked into the dirt. And it worked, or seemed to. Some towns, spared by the first wave, credited the flagellants. In a world where doctors burned herbs and carried dead weasels for protection, the logic didn't seem any stranger. But power is rarely quiet for long. The more cities they visited, the more attention they drew. Local leaders started to worry. Bishops wrinkled their vestments, and in the heart of Rome, someone began to write a letter, because what had started as an act of public penance was starting to look a lot like a movement, and the church had no idea who was in charge. To call it chaotic would be to miss the point entirely. The flagellant procession wasn't a riot. It was a ritual, rehearsed, choreographed. Every motion, every wound, timed to echo divine order, or at least to mimic it. These weren't just men flailing in the street. They were conducting a mass without altars, a liturgy made of leather and flesh. The clothing followed a strict code. White robes, slit open at the back to expose the skin, and hoods that covered the face, save for 2 holes where eyes could watch and weep. On the chest, a red cross, not embroidered, but painted, as if the heart were bleeding through the linen. They marched barefoot, slowly, often with chants that looped until the syllables lost meaning and became pure sound. Latin fragments, psalms turned into dirges, the names of Christ recited like spells. And then, at a sign from their leader, a baton raised, a bell rung, a hymn dropped into silence, they would stop, fall to their knees, and begin. The scourges were handmade, often braided by the penitent himself. 3 chords, in imitation of the Trinity, metal tips knotted at the end, sometimes bone, sometimes shards of glass. The idea wasn't simply to cause pain, it was to leave marks, welts, proof. Each lash was struck across the shoulders in a steady rhythm. They didn't scream, that wasn't part of the performance. They chanted through it, eyes unfocused, like men caught between agony and trance. They lashed, until the blood ran freely, until the robes clung wet and heavy, until the crowd, yes, there was always a crowd, fell into silence or sobs. Then they rose, just as slowly, and continued the march. The trail behind them was not symbolic, it was red. For those watching, it was theater, but not entertainment. It was uncomfortable, magnetic, grotesquely holy. Children clung to mothers, merchants crossed themselves, sinners dropped to their knees, half hoping the sight might shock God into subtracting a few years in purgatory. And beneath it all, beneath the lashes, the hymns, the calculated rhythm of the bleeding, was the desperate need to be seen, not by the townsfolk, not even by the priests, but by the only authority that mattered, a God who, by all accounts, had grown silent. The lashes were punctuation in a prayer too urgent for words. But of course, when people suffer publicly, when pain becomes a kind of currency, others start to spend it in stranger ways. Not everyone who picked up the whip was a monk. Not everyone came for penance. Some came for something else entirely. Not all wounds were for God. There's a peculiar alchemy that happens when suffering is put on stage. At first, it's sacred. Then it's contagious. Then, if no one's watching closely enough, it becomes something else altogether. In the case of the flagellants, it was spectacle with a pulse. Crowds gathered like they would for a saint's relic or a public hanging. The reactions varied. Some wept openly. Others collapsed in fits of religious ecstasy, clutching at their own robes, as if guilt could be inhaled. And some, too many, stared wide-eyed, frozen between awe and repulsion. A street sermon delivered not with words, but with wounds. There were reports of spontaneous conversions, of hardened men dropping to their knees mid-procession and begging to join in. Some did. They stripped on the spot and borrowed someone else's scourge. Others fainted. Others tried not to look and failed. The procession had a logic all its own. It was persuasion by bloodletting, not gentle, not even rational, but deeply effective. Because when a man walks into your village, dripping with his own penance, you start to ask questions about your own spine, your own soul. And it didn't stop at cities. These performances spilled into the countryside, into fields, through frozen mountain passes. Villagers lined roads to watch the bleeding caravans pass. Children imitated them. Priests, at first bewildered, sometimes offered shelter. And in more than a few cases, those priests were ignored or challenged. Because the flagellants weren't content with just performing, they began preaching, not softly, not deferentially. They claimed to speak with divine authority. Some declared visions, others delivered messages they claimed came from angels. The whip was no longer just a symbol, it was a scepter. And slowly, the procession started looking less like a penance, and more like a movement. The church took notice. Rome did not smile upon self-appointed prophets who skipped mass and rewrote theology in open wounds, especially when those wounds started drawing bigger crowds than the local bishop ever had, and especially when rumors began to spread that the flagellants had their own hierarchy, their own creeds, their own secrets, whispered after dark. Some monasteries banned them, others welcomed them and quietly regretted it. because even the holiest pain, once turned into public theater, becomes hard to contain, especially when it's catching on. And soon, even the church wasn't sure who was holding the whip anymore. For all its discipline, the movement wasn't just men with ropes and martyr complexes. Pain, it turned out, was democratic, and the flagellant rite, once thought too brutal, too public, too male, proved oddly magnetic to others the church had long kept behind screens. Women came, they watched, then they joined. It wasn't widespread at first. A few cases, scattered across Germany and the Low Countries. Young women, old women, mothers, virgins, all stepping into the blood-drenched choreography. Some marched beside their brothers and husbands. Others formed separate lines. The lash fell on their backs the same way it did on the men's, though often with more disapproval from onlookers. The church squirmed. The sight of a veiled woman stripping to the waist in public, whipping herself to the rhythm of a hymn, left theologians muttering into their collars. It blurred lines they liked, kept sharp between piety and impropriety, between the sacred and the sensual. The female body, so often associated with temptation, was now beating itself into sanctity. And that, frankly, made people uncomfortable. Rumors swelled, not always fair, not always false, that some of the female participants moaned with each lash, that some processions turned orgiastic when night fell, that eroticism lurked just beneath the chant, a religious trance with sweat and spectacle too closely interwoven. Historians now suspect these claims say more about the watchers than the whipped. But even so, the anxieties were real. A woman in pain, publicly, voluntarily, complicates everything, especially when that pain becomes holy. And they weren't alone. Children began appearing in the ranks too. Some were barely in adolescence, skin so thin the first lash split it like parchment. They mimicked the motions of their elders, sang the same hymns, and sometimes collapsed from the effort. Whether they were dragged in by fanatic parents, or drawn in by the moral gravity of it all, is impossible to know. What is certain is that the church looked at the bruises on those young backs, and finally said, "Enough." The movement, once tolerated, then questioned, now began to look heretical, not just because it challenged the church's authority, but because it cracked the social order. It invited the wrong bodies to suffer. It blurred the sacred with the carnal. It spilled blood that hadn't been authorized. And when heresy becomes flesh, Rome doesn't send a letter, it sends inquisitors. It's one thing to suffer for Christ, it's another to do it without asking permission. At first, the church watched the flagellants with cautious indulgence. Here were lay people, after all, embracing the passion of Christ with raw sincerity. No wine, no feasts, no theological squabbles, just rope and repentance. It was messy, sure, but sincere. And for a while, that was enough. But the movement didn't stay put, and neither did the theology. By 1349, as the plague carved holes into the fabric of Europe, the flagellants had gone from fringe spectacle to full-blown spiritual insurgency. They no longer just marched and bled, they preached, loudly, publicly. They claimed visions, predicted apocalypses, and declared the church corrupt. Some even began issuing their own indulgences. The lash had become a pulpit, and the pulpit no longer faced Rome. They formed fraternities with secret rituals, appointed their own masters of discipline, refused communion, declared that priests were unnecessary, that the whip, wielded with proper contrition, did more for the soul than any sermon. And they had followers, hundreds in some towns, thousands in others. Which is, of course, when the church changed its mind. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull condemning the flagellants as heretics. Bishops were ordered to disband the groups, arrest their leaders, and confiscate their scourges. Some processions were attacked mid-ritual, others simply disappeared. The streets emptied of hoods and hymns. The blood dried, though never completely. But heresy, once touched by the divine, doesn't fade so icily, especially when it bleeds so beautifully. Some flagellants retreated underground, others folded themselves into sanctioned monastic orders, trading the street for the cell. And perhaps the most dangerous didn't stop at all. They kept walking, kept bleeding, kept chanting. And though the movement fractured, its logic stayed intact. That the body could be weaponized against sin. That pain could speak to God directly. That flesh, properly scourged, could become scripture. But if the whip was a tool of rebellion, it was also a kind of shield, one sharpened during plague years, when death walked every street and people turned to blood, to bargain with heaven. Because if the world was ending, then perhaps it was time to scream into the void, through the skin. Europe, by 1348, smelled like rot and incense. The Black Death didn't arrive with trumpets. It crept in, soft-footed, flea-born, unassuming. One day the baker was coughing. The next, his skin was purple and his children were buried behind the chapel. Entire towns emptied in weeks. Fields grew wild. Churches rang bells for funerals no one attended. And across this landscape of stink and silence, the flagellants marched. To the dying, they weren't madmen. They were surgeons of the soul. Their logic was almost comfortingly simple. The plague was punishment, not bacteria, but wrath. Sin had piled up. God had noticed. The solution: public, unrelenting, agonizing repentance. Let the skin pay what the heart owed. If the village bled enough, perhaps the angel of death would pass over. And so they came, moving from city to city like fevered antibodies. Their arrival was marked by the sound of weeping hymns and the smell of open wounds. They lashed themselves in courtyards, in churches, in marketplaces, cleared of corpses just hours before. The sick watched from windows. The healthy wept in advance. In some places, the plague did subside after their visit. Correlation, coincidence, miracle. No one cared. It was hope, and hope bled well. But penance isn't a controlled substance. The more they whipped, the more others joined. A kind of penitential contagion took hold. It wasn't just guilt anymore, it was imitation. One man bled, so another had to. One town repented, so the next one must do more. Deeper cuts, longer marches, higher hymns. Soon, they weren't just begging for mercy, they were demanding it. From kings, from bishops, from God himself. And sometimes, they looked for scapegoats. In the chaos of plague years, flagellant processions occasionally turned violent. Against Jews, against heretics, against anyone whose presence could be construed as sinful enough to explain divine punishment. The whip turned outward. Blood begets blame. And the church, ever strategic, saw the danger. Not just to theology, but to stability. These weren't just religious men anymore. They were mobs with doctrine. Unhoused, unsupervised, unafraid. By the 1360s, the movement had withered or gone underground. But the pain didn't leave. It just changed venues. The lash, once public, retreated into cloisters, into bedrooms, into the quiet corners of convents and cells. Because the logic hadn't died with the plague. It had simply grown more discreet. After all, not everyone wants to bleed in the square. Some prefer to do it alone, by candlelight. The whip was never buried. It was folded, reverently, and tucked into drawers beside rosaries and relics. Out of sight, but not out of practice. When the church slammed the door on public flagellation, it didn't erase the appetite for penance, it privatized it. The spectacle retreated behind cloister walls, where monks and nuns kept the rhythm going in the dark. Pain, now dressed in silence, found new instruments. Hair shirts woven with coarse animal fibers, chains wrapped around thighs, stones tucked under mattresses. The body remained the problem, and thus, the solution. Medieval mystics embraced the tradition with unnerving enthusiasm. St. Catherine of Siena carved Christ's name into her skin with a blade. St. Rose of Lima wore a spiked crown beneath her veil. St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, not to be outdone, slept on broken pottery and beat herself until her confessor told her to tone it down. She didn't. They weren't anomalies. They were models. Even long after the plague, spiritual literature praised mortification as a tool for taming the passions. Discipline the body, and you free the soul. Let the flesh remind you hourly that heaven must be earned through discomfort. Because nothing said devotion like a bloodstain that nobody saw. In the early modern period, groups like the Jesuits codified it. Not every member used whips, but the practice was sanctioned, supervised, and quietly encouraged. The Spanish mystic San Juan de la Cruz whipped himself nightly. Others used cilices, spiked chains worn tight around the thigh, to draw blood with every step. It was never about sadism, at least, not officially. It was about control. Even today, whispers of the old ways survive. The conservative Catholic group Opus Dei, often misunderstood, sometimes mythologized, includes mortification among its optional practices. Whips, yes. Cold showers, sure. Sleeping without a pillow, absolutely. The logic is unchanged. Sacrifice purifies. Pain humbles. The soul listens better when the body is sore. It's no longer paraded down the street, but but it's still there behind closed doors. In rulebooks, in the private corners of faith where shame meets ecstasy. And beneath it all lingers the original question the flagellants asked with their blood. How loud must the flesh scream before heaven hears? Because what they were doing beneath the chants, beyond the spectacle, wasn't just devotion, it was communication. In a world without microphones, pain became the loudest language. It bypassed theology, it leaped over scripture. No one needed to translate a flayed back or a bruised thigh. You didn't argue with a man who had bled for something, not even God did, presumably. Pain stripped speech down to its most primal, most persuasive form. It said, "I'm serious." It said, "I'm willing." It said, "Look." And perhaps that's the strangest part of the flagellant legacy. Not the blood, not the chants, not the heresies, but the idea that pain could be a kind of speech. That a lash across the shoulder could be a letter addressed to heaven, signed in red. That suffering, if properly performed, could drag divinity into the conversation. This wasn't exclusive to medieval Europe, of course. Across the world, cultures have cracked open the body in the hope that something sacred might spill out. Amazonian initiates endure wasp stings to prove worth. Sufi mystics whirl themselves into bruised ecstasy. Fakirs lie on beds of nails. The logic is eerily consistent. When words fail, wound. But the flagellants weren't mystics. They were accountants of sin, scribes of flesh, determined to balance the cosmic ledger with their own blood. Their message wasn't enlightenment, it was apology. And their performance, however grotesque, made sense in a world teetering on the edge of judgment. Because if divine silence felt like abandonment, then perhaps noise, even in the form of open wounds, was the only answer. The Church, of course, preferred its prayers quieter, its suffering metaphorical. But it never quite managed to extinguish the idea that pain could do what doctrine couldn't. Even now, it lingers, in the monastic cell, in the whispered vow, in the strange, aching human impulse to turn agony into something sacred, into something seen, into something that means. Because for all our hymns and sermons, for all the gold-leafed Bibles and incense clouds, there's still something unbearably honest about the sound of leather hitting skin. Something raw, something old, something that says, "I'm here," and maybe, just maybe, that someone is listening.